Today we're going to be diving into our stash and our scraps and making this beautiful block book from stuff you already have lying around. Now, a block book is used to hold the unfinished blocks for the quilts you're working on to keep everything organized, and it can even be used kind of as like a little mini design wall. There are several pages allowing you to put several blocks inside and keep everything beautifully organized so that the next time you go to work on your project, you know exactly where to start. This is especially nice to use if you don't actually have a design wall and have to use a design floor or a design bed and can't leave your pieces out long term. Hi, my name is Jamie Bright. I'm the founder of Craft a Dream, and I am so grateful to be making this project here with you today. So let's get started. First, you're going to need 2 pieces of fabric. One of them needs to be a little bit bigger than the other one. So this one I have at 34 inches by 16 inches approximately. Now, it doesn't have to be exactly perfect, but that's approximately the size you're going to want to have for this specific project. Next, you're going to want a piece of batting that is the same size. Finally, you're going to need your second piece of fabric, or if you have some blocks around, that's a little bit smaller than these. So this one should be about 32 to 33 inches wide and 14.5 inches tall. Now, I made this Improv flying geese panel as part of the monthly challenges I do in the Quilters Play Space community that I run. And for the month of April, our challenge was to do flying geese in some way. And I haven't done a lot of flying geese. That's part of why I picked that as a challenge, because I really wanted to increase my skills with it. And so I did improv flying geese with some leftover scraps that I had from trimming off little pieces while making the luminary glow up quilt. But you don't have to have a pieced fabric cover. You can do a single piece of fabric that you really love, or whatever you like. If you've got some orphan blocks around, you can piece them together to get the size you want. Because I knew I was going to be making this block book, I specifically decided to use this monthly challenge that we were doing and make it into the cover. And I have to say, I am so in love with this. So definitely give it a try if you want to. I used Terrafonen's hand loom fabrics that came out in May, and they are delightful. And then I mixed that with a light denim fabric that I had from my stash that was really beautiful in terms of color. It's a little bit stretchy though, so it was a bit of a challenge to keep everything straight, but I'm in love. Like, I absolutely am in love with this. And that's the whole reason I do monthly challenges, is to inspire new ideas and play a little bit and see what comes out of it. I've got a separate video on my channel showing exactly how I made this flying geese panel, so check it out if you're interested. Our next step is we need to actually quilt these layers together. So we are going to do this just like we would do a regular quilt, where we are going to put the backing down, and I want to make sure mine's directional, so that side is up. And then we're going to take we're basically making a quilt sandwich, so let me take this off while I put the batting on and make sure I do it right. So you're going to lay your batting out on top of your background fabric. Smooth it out so there are no folds or wrinkles in it. This is just a piece of leftover batting that I had from making a different quilt. You can use any batting. I think this is a thin cotton batting, but it doesn't matter if it's thin or thick as long as it's big enough. And if you have 2 smaller pieces that you want to sew together to make it work, you can absolutely do that. Okay, so now we've got that one on there. And then I want to make sure that I have this in the orientation that I want it to be. So here, I didn't leave a lot of extra edge. So if you do want to leave a lot of extra edge and quilt this on like a quilt machine, you can add extra onto your background fabric and batting if you want to. I really only left about 1 inch to ½ inch on each side, because when I'm doing something small like this, it works fine for me, and so I just kind of do my own thing. But I want to make sure this is like smoothed out nicely, and then I'm going to baste it. Now you can use pins if you want to, like safety pins to hold this on. So I've always done thread basting because it's much easier to sew through. Look at this beautiful needle case my partner made me out of antler and wood. It's just beautiful for holding needles. And So I'm just going to take any needle. It doesn't matter which one you do, what size it is. Okay, and we're going to make really big stitches. We're not going to do tiny stitches. We're going to make something significant. And the one thing that's kind of tricky about thread basting is you need a lot of it and it can get tangled easy. So that's the only thing I don't like. And I always pick a really bright contrasting color so that it's easy to see and pull out later, because you don't want to leave this in. This is just a temporary thing to hold it. And in part I do this because I really hate using safety pins and I don't like how they feel on my fingers. I don't like removing them or putting them in. Maybe that's just a me thing. But in part I do it because this is how I was taught a long time ago by my mom before she started using safety pins as much. And it just always has worked super well for me. And it works really well when you're hand quilting. And I don't think it leaves as big of holes in your quilt as you might get from like safety pins. So if I was doing a big quilt, I would start in the middle and work my way outwards. Because this is tiny and I'm not worried about things shifting, I'm going to start over here on this end. And I'm just going under and up. If you do this on a table, make sure you have a mat or something underneath it so that it doesn't scratch your table. It's just the same thing with safety pins or anything else, right? So the first stitch, it's a little awkward doing this with a camera in front of me, so bear with me. So you get your first stitch in, and then you just keep doing, see how far away I am? I'm like, you know, a solid hand width away. I'm gonna do under and up, and then I'll do a couple more right up this row, right along the edge, and I'm going through all the layers of the fabric. And I'm just gonna go all the way up to the corner for now. And then I'll pull that through. Then you're not pulling as often or as much, which is helpful. And then I'm just gonna keep doing this, and I'm gonna go over here, and I'm gonna do, see, I always do it along the edge, and then I'm gonna go down. And I'll just do that for each of the rows. If you've never used a thimble before, they are incredible. So I push it through with my thimble and it keeps you from hurting your fingers. So highly recommend a thimble. And you don't want these like overly tight where they're pulling, you know, pulling up on the fabric or anything. I don't even feel like I need to go right here. That's closer than you need to for basting. So I'm going to jump over here. It's just holding it in place. Now I'm just going to do like one more here, and then I'm going to tie it off, and I'll show you how I do that. So I take the needle, I cross the thread over existing thread, I go under it with the needle and up. I don't even pull that tight, and then I do the same thing. I go under the needle and make a second knot right there. Then it might slide around a little bit. If that's the case, you can always do a third one. I don't worry about it too much because there's not a lot of tension on that. That doesn't have to hold long. And you cut that off, and you can see this is loose. That's okay because it's holding at all the places it needs to hold. That's the important part. So we're halfway there. Do this one more time, and we should have what we need to start quilting this together. If you've never done this, this is just a knot where you wrap it around your finger and you make a little X. So you cross that, and then you roll it off, and then you grab and pull it to the end. That's how you do the knots, for just in case you haven't seen that before. And now she is all basted and ready to be quilted. Now you can quilt this in any way that you want to. You don't have to machine quilt, you could hand quilt it. I don't have a fancy quilting machine. I mean, I have a sewing machine. I'm going to do it on my domestic sewing machine. I'm not going to put a walking foot on or anything fancy. I'm just going to use my regular foot and walk it through, and just be really careful. You'll get better results if you have a walking foot you can put on. But I'm going to be lazy today because with something small like this, it's not going to be a big deal. And I am hoping that it'll all turn out well. even though it's nice and small. The nice thing is you don't have to worry about like removing this at all until after you've already done your quilting. You can quilt right over this thread basting and it won't hurt anything and it'll come right out at the end. So it's totally fine. And you can see like these layers are held together well. You can move it around. You can see your stitches in the back where it's all tacked together. So with that, we're going to move over to the sewing machine and I'm going to show you how I quilt this. If you're just using regular fabric, then you really can do something very simple. You could do straight up and down lines or like crosshatch, or you don't have to go crazy with the quilting. It's literally just to hold these layers together, just like with a regular quilt. And so you can get as creative as you want, or you can do something very, very simple like stripes, you know, one way and then again the other way. I am going to outline all of my flying geese. So let's head to the machine and we'll get started on that. Before we start sewing on top, in case you've never done this, I didn't put my walking foot on. If you have one, you can do that. I did match my threads. So my top thread is a navy and my bottom thread is a black because this background fabric is more of a black and I wanted it to kind of blend in. And I'm actually going to test this and check the tension because this top thread is thicker a little bit than my bottom thread. I think it's a 30 weight instead of a 50 weight. And so it's not a big deal. My machine can handle it, but I might have to mess around with the tension. And so I'll show you how to do that. So here, I just took a piece of my batting. I just have a single piece of the fabric that I'm wrapping around it. And I am going to do kind of you don't want to do too short of a stitch length, but you can go a little longer with the quilting. I'm probably at about a 2.5 to 3 here. I don't like my stitches really long, so that's why I keep them a little smaller, but you can go 3 to 4 if you want. And I'm just gonna test it out and see how it looks. So what I'm looking for is any inconsistencies. Like I only see the top thread here. I only see the bottom thread here. So this is good. I'm very comfortable with this. It's going to be fine. So if your top is really straight and you can see bottom loops coming up, that means the tension on top is pulling too hard and it's too high, and so you lower it. Whereas if you go on this side and you see that there's a bunch of loops getting pulled into the back from the front, so this was the top. So if the back has a bunch of loops, kind of like that, but that was from me cutting it, that would mean that there's not enough tension up here to pull the threads towards the top, and so I would need to add tension to the top. For this one, you do want to start in the middle of your panel, whichever direction. I'm not going to start like the center middle, but I'm going to start in the top middle. And it does help to have a wider table around if you can for doing this. If you can't, that's okay. You can use any machine. You really can. I know like people get weirded out by it, but you can use whatever domestic machine you have. And I am going to do my best to just follow this line based on the edge of my foot and go from there. I do want to point out right there, I sewed right over the basting stitch, no problem. I don't do a lot of machine quilting. I generally do hand quilting. So mine is not going to be the most exciting or amazing, but it gets the job done, and hopefully you can see that it's not that hard. Like I'm making sure that when I'm moving this around, my layers aren't shifting, but the basting thread does that really well. So I know you can get fancy gloves to do this. I'm just simple me. So no fancy foot, no fancy gloves, and I'm not going to worry about it because it's small. When it's bigger, you're going to get more ruffles and you're going to have more issues. And I might run into some doing it this way, but I'm not going for perfection. This is just a block book. It's not a quilt that I'm going to be entering into a show, so I'm totally fine with it just being good enough. So I am just wanting to make sure that this is kind of flat when I do it. My fabric's a little stretchy, so it's not always the flattest, and I did improv all of this, but overall I think this is going to turn out really nice. So the next step take out all of the basting threads. Okay, so now we're going to trim our edges to make sure they are nice and square. Now the thing we want to make sure, if you're doing this flying geese thing, you don't want to chop off more than 1/4 inch from those points or you'll lose them when you do the binding. So I'm going to make sure that I'm not doing that as I'm cutting. And when I'm cutting this, I'm making sure that this is a square edge. Same thing here, I'm watching for the points to make sure that there's enough of a point there. So here, it's a little bit short and I'm gonna fudge it. I am, just because it won't matter in the end. That's what I get for doing this all improv. Now there's one more set of lines that you need to do that I didn't mention, is that in your middle, so if you fold this in half, when we do our book, we're gonna have, this is gonna be the spine here. So in this case, it's gonna be wide like this, where I'm gonna sew a double line down and back on each side of the seam to make this fold easier. Okay, so I have sewn 2 lines right here. This will both help it to fold a little better when you are making this into a book, and it'll also be good guides for when we start putting our pages in. But we can't put our pages in yet because we need to bind this. We need to put a binding on the edge. I have selected this fabric to be my binding fabric. And because this is pretty thin and I don't want a ton of binding on it, I think I'm just going to do a 2 1/4 inch binding as opposed to a 2 1/2 inch binding. You can do whichever you like. And looks like I'm going to need 3 of these. 3 strips, 1, 2, 3. That'll be enough for binding around the edge of this. Now it is time for me to put the binding on this, and when I do quilts, I'll sew it to the front and then I'll flip it around to the back and hand stitch it down. But I also want to do this faster than that. This isn't going to be an heirloom quilt, even though it's absolutely stunning. But what I'm going to do for this one is I'm going to do the whole binding by machine, and I'll walk you through the process, but I'm going to start by sewing it onto the back of the fabric here, and then we're going to flip it around and we're going to machine sew it on the front so that we can make sure it looks really nice. So let's head over to the machine and we'll put our binding on. I'm going to start my binding like here-ish near the middle of my book edge, the long edge, and I'm just going to match the edge up with the edge of the book cover, and I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch. It'll be probably a scant 1/4 inch because I don't want to sew any of those triangle points if I don't need to. So I'm going to just try and be very mindful of that. Now for binding, if you want to have perfectly mitered corners, there's a really easy way to do it. First, you fold this, first make sure this edge is lined up here. And then I'm holding it here, anchoring it there, and I'm folding this back, and this corner, I'm matching up with the corner of the quilt top, or the cover for this case, and then I'm making this, just finger pressing it there. Now you can see there's a folded line. It's hard to see in this fabric specifically, but that's my stop line. If I'm sewing a 1/4 inch in, I'll stop at that fold line. Okay. Okay, and then I'm going to lift it up. And I'm going to actually take it out. I don't need to, I'm not going to cut the thread because we'll come back to that. But now what we're going to do is we fold that back up like this. We folded it up and it's at exactly 45 degrees. You can tell because this line here is straight. And then we fold it down with that corner, the fold right at that corner, just like that, so that it makes, so that this fold is matching the edge of the line and this edge is matched up here. And then you can just sew straight down. You don't have to do any other manipulation. Just like that. And then it'll be a perfectly mitered corner when we flip it. That's all it takes. Okay, now I stopped with a gap here. This is where our binding starts. I don't know, 6 inches maybe, something like that. I never am too precise with it. And now I'm gonna trim these threads. And now we need to connect the binding here and here. Okay, so the way we do this, you take your binding, no matter what width it is. This is 2 1/4. You can do 2 1/2, doesn't matter. You cut a little piece off. And now what you do is you overlap your binding, put this piece down like that, and then that's how much they should overlap. So this edge should get cut off right there. Okay. And then this one on the bottom should get cut right at that edge. So if I move this over here, so that one goes there, that's the edge there. So then this one we should cut off right at that blue line there. Okay, so now they overlap exactly the width of our binding, which is great, because then what we're going to do is you take your binding, you open it up, and you put them good sides together at a 45-degree angle like this. So you open them up and you see how they're kind of this way, like that. You can put a pin in there if you want to. I normally don't use pins at all, but I am today for the sake of showing it and because I've been sewing a lot today, and I know that when I sew a lot, sometimes I make more mistakes, so pin will keep it holding. We're gonna go from this corner all the way over to this corner with a seam. Oops. Okay, so I just eyeball it. You could draw a line if you want to. Trim your threads. Take out the pin. Before you do any cuts, watch this. See? Test it. Make sure that it lays right and it's the right, length. So like when that's cut off, this will be perfect for us to just sew through. So I'm gonna, now that I've checked that, I'm gonna cut this flap because I don't want all that bulk in my binding. But that is the easiest way I have found. Always have your binding be the exact perfect length. So now when I'm gonna just finger press this to the side. So now when we go to finish sewing this edge up, so I'm overlapping where I was already stitching up here. And I should be able to sew all the way over to here where the seam starts again. There's a tiny, tiny, tiny pucker there, but it's on the inside, not the outside, so I'm not gonna worry about it. Our binding is attached, and we just need to flip it over and sew it to the front. I'm not going to start right in the corner. I'm going to start a little bit away from the corner, and I'm pulling it this way in the back, and you can see right where the line is. And so we want to make sure that we go over that line just a little bit at least. Okay. I did a back stitch to anchor it. It's up to you. Now, when we sew this, like here, my corner is going to get cut off if I go all the way there, so I am going to make it a little thinner there. But I can see exactly where it's going to go. And I'm very, very happy with this method. It works very, very well. I kind of keep the edge of the binding right on the inside of this foot, because then I know the stitch will be right on the edge of it. Okay, we're coming up to a corner. I see some threads from before that need trimming. So when you get near to the corner, all you do is you take and you flip this inside out. See, this side's already beautifully mitered, and you'll see when we get to it that it's very easy. Now you want to pull this down towards you so that we're going to make this into a 45-degree angle right here. So what I mean by that is when you come up to the corner, this edge, you want to, down here where your finger is, you want to kind of pull this towards you this way so that we get a nice fold there, because that's going to make our corner perfectly mitered. Okay, so when you get close, then you just flip this over, just like that, and it's mitered perfectly, you'll see. You just hold it there until you get one stitch into it, then you pivot. Oh, this is just absolutely perfect binding. And you don't have to do that edge at all. In fact, that's pretty thick. You want to avoid doing that. But because of how we folded our corners, you don't need to. You just need to catch them and fold them over that way, and they're absolutely perfect. And I did backstitch right at the end there, right where we met up. Now I'll trim my threads. Perfectly mitered corners. Beautiful. Hard to see when it's a dark fabric. And then if you look at the other side, there's the stitch line for the binding on top, but it's right next to the binding. So it looks wonderful. Totally looks great. All right, so now it's time for us to put pages inside of our cover. So here's the couple of options you have for pages. We have here, this is some leftover flannel that I have from making myself a quilt wall, and it's perfectly white. It's fabric sticks to it really well. And so I took this, I did finish the edges so that it wouldn't fray, since this will fray very bad if I don't. But I made 4 pieces that are 28 inches wide by 13 inches tall. So it's a little bit smaller than the book, which is fine because we want it to fit inside the book here. It could have been a little bigger if I had wanted, not too worried about it, but I wanted it just a tiny bit smaller. But you don't have to just use flannel. You could also use fleece, in which case you don't need to finish the edges, because that would be fine. You could use extra batting that you have, and that works really, really well. And the nice thing is you wouldn't need to do anything to the edges of these either, because it's not going to fray. So you can make your pages out of all sorts of different things. You can mix and match for that matter. It's best to use something that's a little bit fuzzy, like flannel or batting or fleece, so that when you're putting your blocks in here, if you want to stick the pieces here, they will stay stuck to the page and they're not going to fall out. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take these pages over to the sewing machine, and we are going to fold them in half, because each of these is actually like 2 pages. And then we are going to sew them to the binding right in the middle. But I've got my page here. And since I'm using flannel, I was able to iron a crease in it. So I know exactly where the middle is, and that's what I want to sew down. Now, if you are using batting, you might want to use pins to mark your center crease, because obviously you might be able to iron it depending on what's in it. If it's got some poly in it, that's not always the best idea. We've got these 2 lines here to show us where the binding of our book is. And so I'm going to start right next to one of those, just a little bit off of it, just like this. And I'm going to do my best to center the page vertically since it's not all the way. I made it a little bit smaller on purpose. And so there's about 3/4 of an inch on each side there. This is why our stuff doesn't have to be perfectly exact. It can just be close and that's good enough, okay? So then, now that I have it going vertically right along the edge of that line, I'm gonna open it up. And I am gonna use a pin here to keep this from shifting. Just gonna put that one here and put a pin down below, just on the inner layer to keep this one here as well. And you can still see that line. So now I'm gonna roll this side up. I'm gonna start up here, and I'm just gonna start right on that line, back stitch. And then I'm gonna sew straight down the line, right in the middle of that page. And I'm just gonna back stitch a little at the bottom just to secure that. Removing the pin. And now we have our first set of pages sewn on. Now we want to do the second set next to it. Now you'll want to space these out based on the number of pages that you have. And I have a couple pages that were a little bit narrower than the other ones, simply because that piece of flannel was a little bit narrower. And so it's, I'm not worried about it at all. It doesn't need to match perfect. But I have this seam just spaced over to the side of this one, about where I want it. And I'm going to pin up here again, just to hold that in place. Look at me using pins. I never use pins, hardly ever. And then down here as well. And I'm gonna make sure these are rolled up so that they're not under there. And I'm gonna, again, sew right down this center line here. I will back stitch a little bit. All right, so now we have our second set of pages done. Now I'm gonna do the exact same thing with the other two sets. And I just am not gonna cross this line because that's our other binding line, which I know is hard to see in the light, but I can see it in the quilting. That's part of why we did our binding, is to know where that is. We're just making sure these pages aren't tucked under there and getting sewn in any way. The number of pages I have might be different than the number of pages you have. And you can always go back and add more of these later too. That's the beautiful part of all this. It's not just a one and done. Like if you end up having extra scraps in the future and you want to add a few more pages, you can easily do that. You just put them in between with the current pages. I spread mine out evenly because I think for now we'll see if this many pages is a good amount or not. I can always add more if I want. So the final step that we need to do is we need to put a tie on it to hold it closed. All right, so I've got a ribbon here and that's what I'm going to use for my tie. And I'm going to take one edge and I'm going to cut it at a diagonal to help reduce the fraying. And then this one I'm going to cut clean across. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to fold it under twice and sew that just to keep that end from fraying. This might be a little bit tricky because it's so lightweight, but that's what I'm going to do. The tension wasn't quite right on that, but that's okay. And then I'm going to do a second one. So now we need to find the middle of this. Okay, so that's right here. Take one of our ribbons. I'm going to just put it right on top, right there. Make sure the rest of the book is out of the way. Then I'm going to top stitch this down. I am glad that I matched the threads, even if it's a little extra hassle. Right, now we'll do the other one. Oh, and look at that. There's a tiny, tiny pucker there. Right there. That was in there from the binding. And I get to cover it right up because that's the perfect spot for it to go. And it'll not get seen. That's lucky. Okay, so pull all of that well out of the way. Put your ribbon on top. Sure, I over sewed that on, but it'll stay. That's what's important. One thing I am gonna do, because I know this will fray a little bit, you might be able to melt that, but I'm gonna tie a knot right at the end of my ribbon so that if it does fray, it's only gonna fray so far. Oh yeah, look at that, it's already starting to fray. So we'll just do that. And that ribbon can be as long as you like or as short as you like, it doesn't really matter. This is not the highest quality ribbon, but it'll do. Let me get this thing loaded with blocks and show it to you. Now, if you love the Flying Geese panel as much as I did, and you'd like a step-by-step tutorial to see exactly how I did every step of it, watch this video next.